All right, so today we're going to talk about systems thinking, approaches to analyzing food systems. And these are the learning objectives of today's lecture. So the first is to define systems thinking and explain its relevance in analyzing food systems problems. The second is to discuss the different ways in which systems thinking can be applied to food systems research and practice. The third is to analyze the elements of the food system and their interconnections in the context of multiple burdens of malnutrition in LMICs. And lastly, to utilize systems thinking to think about root causes of context-specific food systems problems. And hopefully, if we have time towards the end of the lecture, we'll be able to do some group breakout sessions to think through those. So what is systems thinking? So this is a definition from one of the papers that I believe that you had as part of your readings. So systems thinking is an iterative learning process in which we replace a reductionist, narrow, short-run, static view of the world with a holistic, broad, long-term, dynamic view, reinventing our policies and institutions accordingly. So a lot of times when you're thinking about, say, nutrition problems that you might see in a given context, you might just think about, what are the immediate causes of that nutrition problem? And when you're thinking about systems, you kind of broaden it out and think about, say, the food system drivers, how they might influence, say, the food supply chain or the food environment, and then how consumers' own lived experiences might influence the way they interact with that food environment. And all those different pieces come together in terms of thinking about why people are doing the things that they're doing in terms of their behaviors related to diets and nutrition. I'm going to pass it over now.
Great. Well, thanks, Rana. Hi, everyone. So I think, Shana gave some very good examples of what we mean with systems thinking, but I'm going to focus on one of the words that was used, which is dynamic, because this is quite an important notion that you might see coming up when you read about systems. So in systems thinking, we really care about the dynamic behavior of problems or components of the system. And what that really means is how things change over time. So, for example, Shana, can you next slide? Yeah. So, for example, we want to describe, let's say, the problem of malnutrition globally. And we can say, there are 148 million children under the age of 5 with stunting, or 37 million children with overweight. And this tells us something about this burden of the problem, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Because if we look at how things have changed over time, we will see that stunting has reduced over the last 20 years quite significantly, and overweight has been increasing. So there must be something in this global food system that drives this overtime change of stunting and overtime change of overweight. So looking at how things change over time can really help us understand the problem. And this is what systems thinking focus on. Next slide, please. So before we talk more specifically about food systems, I'm going to give you some broad characteristics of complex systems more generally, because this concept of systems thinking didn't start in public health, started in business and so on. So we're going to talk about some of these characteristics before we talk more specifically about food systems. So first of all, I'll start with the first one. Well, in complex systems, in systems thinking, we have a so-called endogenous perspective. So what does that mean? Sometimes we use this sentence to explain what an endogenous perspective is, that the behavior of the system is the result of system structure. So I'm going to break this sentence down. First of all, when we talk about behavior, as I said, we talk about how things change over time. So in order to understand how things change over time, we assume that the way that things change over time is because of how the system is structured. And what does that mean? Shana, can you please next slide? So many times we might think that the problem is a result of individual factors that are as you see on the left side of the picture, that they might be outside of what we call the system boundary. They could be exogenous variables that are not impacted by anything else within a system. But in reality, we think that the behavior of the system these variables are not really important when it comes to how this the problem changes over time. What really drives this change is how these different components of the system interact with each other. So essentially, the most important thing in a complex system is how these different components interact with each other. And natural outcome of the, yeah, you can move on, of this kind of interaction of how things interact with each other is that we have feedback. Feedback is a very important component in complex systems. It's really the building block of a complex system. And what do we mean with feedback? Usually, let's say in epidemiology, we think about a risk factor and an outcome. A risk factor or an exposure can lead to an outcome. But in reality, this chains of an outcome can feed back into this exposure, creating what we call feedback mechanisms. And these feedback mechanisms can be either reinforcing, so vicious cycles, or maybe virtuous cycles, where something changes over and over again. We have more and more and more of something, or less and less and less of something. Or it can be balancing, where an action changes, an intervention will change an output, and then this output would stop this action from happening any further, balancing out this increase or this reduction. Another important characteristic of complex systems is time delays. So this refers to the time it takes from a variable A to impact variable B. And this, of course, is important. Generally, we consider this, for example, when, in an epidemiological studies and everything, but it's even more important when these delays are part of feedback loops, feedback mechanisms. So take this example of smoking, for example, that I have here on the right side. So smoking will lead to pleasure or addiction, so a positive feeling. And then the more someone smokes, the more pleasure they get, which means that they will smoke more, which means they will have more pleasure, creating this reinforcing feedback loop of more and more smoking. But obviously smoking can have negative and side effects like lung cancer. And then this can stop people from smoking because, they're scared of getting cancer, maybe they got cancer, and then this will reduce smoking. So these are both feedback mechanisms, but there's a big difference between these two, and this is that the smoking will lead to pleasure very quickly, whereas there's a delay, there's a long time between smoking and lung cancer. And as people, we tend to react to the short-term impact of an action rather than the long-term impact of an action, those that have delays. And this can really impact the way that, we make decisions, not in our personal life only, but also in a decision-making context of a policy context. And then the last important component of a complex system is what we call accumulations. And we often use this example of a bathtub to explain accumulation. So if you imagine a bathtub of maybe a bucket that has a tap, when we turn it on, it fills with water, and then it has a drain where water comes out of. So the amount of water that we have within this bathtub, within this bucket, depends on how quick and how much water comes in from the tap, but also how quick and how much water comes out of the bucket. And these accumulations occur a lot in public health and food systems. So, for example, next slide, please. We can have accumulations of people, for example, accumulations of people with a disease. The higher the incidence of a disease, the more people get a disease, the more people with a disease we will have. But also the fastest, these people are cured, the less people we have. So the amount of people with a disease depends on how quickly they get the disease, but also how quickly they, get better. But beyond of these, material accumulations, we can also have accumulations of what we call information. So this could be things like knowledge or perceptions or habits. So, for example, if a population is exposed, they see, for example, new ultra-processed foods coming into a market. And then the more and more they consume these foods, more they accumulate a habit of ultra-processed food consumption. It'd be harder to change a habitual consumption, a consumption that has been built over years, compared to as a population where ultra-processed foods are new and there's not really a habit built. All right. So why are all these important? Next slide, please. In complex systems, usually we identify as these characteristics as sources of what we call policy resistance. This refers to the way that the system responds to any effort we make to change it, any policy, any intervention. And this will lead to these policies being, fail or be diluted or delayed. So, for example, feedback mechanisms can feedback and have unintended side effects that may make a policy fail, or time delays, might make us react to a short-term impact of a policy instead of a long-term impact of a policy. Accumulations make us, not expect the change to happen as fast or, less quickly. So all these will result to policies failing, and recognizing, acknowledging, and identifying the sources of feedback, delays, and accumulations within the system can help us identify successful policies that expect these kind of characteristics and do something to resist them or change them. So I think that's it from me in terms of, right? Is there anything else? Yeah, right.
Any
So
questions before I start talking specifically about food systems? Okay, doesn't look like there's anything in the chat. All right, so I'm going to shift gears now and talk about food systems specifically. So I'm imagining that most of you have seen this conceptual framework. So this is the food systems framework from the high-level panel of experts report on nutrition and food systems from a few years ago now. This is the adapted version. So there is the initial version that was included in the HLP report. And then since then, there's been some adaptations to it to make it, I think, a bit more clear. And if you look at the original, there's a lot more feedback arrows and a lot more movement throughout the conceptual framework, but this is just kind of simplifying it because a lot of people who are maybe not familiar with systems thinking and thinking about food systems in particular they found it hard to understand. So on the top here we have the drivers of the food system, and so that includes things like climate change, globalization and trade, urbanization, politics and leadership, sociocultural context. All of these different drivers influence the food system. So maybe I'll open it up. What are some of the ways that food systems drivers might influence, say, diets? You can put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. Don't be shy. I'm not seeing anyone typing. Okay, maybe I'll just start with some examples. So climate change, I think, is something that we're all very aware of, especially now over the years. It's become more and more clear how climate change is impacting, or climate variability and extreme weather events are impacting the food system. In many of the places that I work, when you have extreme weather events, that really impacts people's livelihoods. So if they're producers, subsistence farmers, as an example, that can impact the food that they have to consume within their household, but also the income that they have, because subsistence farmers generally sell part of their crop so that they can buy other foods that they're not producing. So that is one way that climate change impacts the food system and is a key driver of it. I see that in the chat there's food insecurity, and food insecurity can influence, it's kind of going back to what Evie said in terms of the feedbacks. Food insecurity is an outcome of the food system. So you see it on the right-hand side, but of this figure. Sorry, I lost my mouse, so I'm just unplugging for a second. And then...
someone mentions war. Is that?
War, yep, so conflict. So conflict is obviously something that's really impacting the food system at the moment. There's many conflicts around the world, and some of them we're definitely hearing a lot about in the mainstream media, but others not so much. And they always impact the food system through a variety of ways. So they impact production. So you can see in places where there's ongoing conflict, it is very hard to be producing food because you are often moving from one place to another. And so you're not able to stay with your fields and ensure that you're able to harvest those crops. It also impacts trade. So we know, say, from the war in Ukraine, that conflict there has led to some disruptions in terms of being able to distribute the wheat that is produced within Ukraine to other countries around the world, which does have impacts in terms of food insecurity. So there's a variety of ways in which conflict can impact the food system. And if you're not looking at those drivers, so if you're not considering these drivers when you're thinking about a nutrition problem, you're likely missing something. Because if you think about, say, let's just stick with the Ukraine. If you are looking at food insecurity in the Ukraine and don't consider the fact that there's current conflict, then you're missing a huge driver of food insecurity, right? Because the conflict is impacting food supply chains, it's impacting the food environment, it's impacting individual factors. So the income that people have, their ability to move about within the system, so their lived experiences interacting with the food system. And then, of course, it impacts, obviously, then their diets and nutrition outcomes. I see also in the chat sociocultural factors. Exactly, yep. So sociocultural factors can influence the food system and nutrition outcomes as well. And there are many, many different ways. Inequity, yes, great. I'm liking that I'm seeing some movement in the chat. So all of those are drivers of the food system. And really what happens is those feed into food supply chains, which we'll talk about in future lectures in more detail. But basically, it's agricultural production, the way it's processed and harvested, distributed, and sold and marketed. And then you have the food environment, which the food supply chain really feeds into the food environment. And the food environment is really the space, like I said, within the food system that consumers interact with. So it's the signals that you have as a consumer in terms of what you should acquire, purchase, and consume. So food availability, affordability, the product properties, things like safety, as an example. Also vendor properties, so the type of vendors, maybe vendor hygiene, the trust you have for those specific vendors, as well as things like food messaging, so promotion, advertising, and the information that you have related to food. And in terms of the food environment, that can be, the built environment, so kind of brick and mortar places that you might purchase food, but it also entails the natural food environment, so things like the foods that people are cultivating for their own consumption within their household, as well as wild foods that people are acquiring within the spaces that they can access food. So it impacts those drivers feed in also to the food environment. And then people's individual factors, all these aspects of the individual themselves, like how much money they have, their knowledge, their literacy levels, their home environment, work environment. Do they have a place for cold storage within their households? Do they have access to a vehicle that they can then take to go to the market? All of those factors influence how people interact with their food environments. And then that leads to consumer behavior, diets, and then these different outcomes in terms of nutrition and health, but also socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. So these are the feedback loops that feed back into the drivers of the food system. So as an example of that, in terms of feedback, if you think of climate change, so climate change or climate variability impacts the food system as a driver. So it's influencing, say, agricultural production, what foods are available and affordable within the food environment, and then what people are eating. But also what people eat, so their diets, influence climate, right? Because if you're consuming, for example, foods that have a high carbon footprint or water footprint, that will lead to environmental impacts. So it is both kind of an instigator of some of the problems within the food system, but also it's also a victim of it as well. So this framework is just another food systems framework that I thought I would share just in case you are not familiar. I think that the HLP report conceptual framework is used a lot, so I'm sure that you're all familiar with that one, but this is the Innocenti framework that was developed specifically for children and adolescents. So it's important when you're thinking about some of the root causes of, say, the multiple burdens of malnutrition, that you think about the different systems within which people operate and how people's individual factors or their lived experience influences how they interact with that system. So this is really, it's drawing on the HLP framework, and it has the drivers on the outside. Sorry, I'm using two screens and my mouse keeps getting lost. So I just have to keep removing my screen and then redoing it. Sorry, but I want to be able to point. So, okay, so the drivers of the food system are on the outside here. So this is along the same lines as the HLPE framework. And then within here, you have the food supply chain, which is also similar. And the exception here is that there's the personal and external food environment, which you might be familiar with. The personal food environment is really kind of this combination of the food environment and people's lived experiences, or those individual factors that are in the HLP report. So the personal and external food environment interact with one another, and then that influences behaviors of both caregivers, but also children and adolescents themselves. So one of the distinctions between this framework and the HLP framework is that it really puts children and adolescents at the center. So the idea is to try and understand, as a child, what are all the factors that are influencing how you're fed, and what that leads to in terms of outcomes for nutrition. So just kind of breaking it down a little bit more and thinking about how some of these relationships might unfold. This is adapted from the State of Food Insecurity report from 2018. And this is looking at pathways to multiple burdens of malnutrition. And actually, this is something that a figure that was adapted from that report. And then since we've used it in one of our own projects as part of a project I'm doing in Kenya related to adolescents and their food systems. And basically, one of the things that we've added into this is to include water insecurity. But basically, the idea is to look at nutrition insecurity, which we're defining. There's not great definitions of nutrition insecurity. So I know that we all are very familiar with the definition of food insecurity, but nutrition insecurity, particularly in the US, but I think it's also expanding to other places as well, is becoming more common in terms of the framing. And there's not a great definition of it, but essentially what it entails is food insecurity. So that's kind of the main part and the thing that's quite familiar to all of us, but also water insecurity and food environments that lack consistent access, availability, and affordability of foods and beverages that promote well-being and prevent disease. So nutrition insecurity, all of these factors influence the multiple burdens of malnutrition through two main pathways. So the first is insufficient intake of energy and macronutrients and micronutrients. So that's the undernutrition pathway, as well as the obesogenic pathway, which is the inexpensive, energy-dense foods of low nutritional value that are often quite pervasive in low-income areas. So if you are someone who is food insecure, so doesn't have a lot of extra money and maybe can just afford one meal per day, it makes rational sense to purchase something that is cheap and really energy dense so that you feel full with that small amount of money. It doesn't necessarily make rational sense to buy some leafy greens. Even though those are more nutritious, you will still feel hungry. And so I think when we're thinking about systems and the systems that influence people's behaviors and their outcomes related to food insecurity, nutrition insecurity, and diets and nutrition outcomes, we really have to think about people's lived experiences and think about them when we're trying to design interventions and essentially include them within the intervention development process. Because otherwise, if you're not thinking about the broader picture, you're going to miss things. And there are so many examples in development and in, say, nutrition intervention and programming work where the interventions don't have an impact. And part of it, and a main part of it, is because it's not responsive to the needs of the community. And so understanding the system from the perspectives of the communities themselves can be really, really important in terms of designing interventions that'll work. Any questions, comments? I'm just looking at the chat.
No, Shauna, nothing else.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm walking through these frameworks on the food system. So there's been more and more shift towards thinking about all these dynamic systems together. And the thing I wanted to point out on this slide is that as we kind of move forward over the last, say, 10 years or so, or 5-10 years, there's been more and more emphasis on thinking about not just the multiple burdens of malnutrition, which is something that has happened only in, like, say, the last 10 or 15 years. Used to be very siloed in terms of the undernutrition, people working together, and then the overweight obesity people working together. And then in, say, the last 10 years or so, those two groups have come together, and there's been recognition of the need to address the double burden of malnutrition or the multiple burdens of malnutrition. And I think moving forward, there's also this recognition that focusing on these syndemics, where you have multiple pandemics at the same time, so obesity, undernutrition, and also climate change. So thinking about them all together is really important, because one of the things that we don't want to do is have interventions related to trying to address, say, undernutrition that have an unintended consequence in terms of increasing overweight and obesity. So there have been some examples of this in the past. For example, in Mexico, their cash transfer program was associated with increases in overweight and obesity among women that were included in the program. So that's an unintended consequence, which is something that we're trying to avoid. So the other, another example of that could be when you have some intervention that maybe it positively impacts undernutrition, or maybe even overweight and obesity as well, say a double duty action that's addressing both, but it has negative impacts in terms of the environment. That is something that we're trying to move away from. And so it's really important to think about things in terms of the systems and the feedback systems. So I put this up mostly not for you to see it, because I know it's hard. It's impossible to read. This is from many, many years ago. So when I was a master's student, like I said, many, many moons ago, this was kind of the beginning coming out in terms of starting to think about obesity in terms of the systems. So there had always historically been this idea that it's just energy in equals energy out. And so people just think about it in that context. So like diets, you need to just reduce your caloric intake, and then you'll reduce overweight and obesity, or you just have to be more physically active and you'll reduce your risk of overweight or obesity. And then this Foresight report came out from the UK government, and it was trying to look at all of the different factors that influence obesity and all of the different systems. So they have in here food production, so food supply chains, also food consumption. Okay, so that makes sense. Social psychology, that's something that not necessarily was at the forefront of people's thinking around overweight and obesity. Individual psychology, individual physical activity, the activity environment, physiology, and then you just have energy balance in the middle. So the idea is not that you have to think about all of these different arrows that are going in every which direction. Some people call this actually the spaghetti diagram because there's just so many arrows in all these different directions. But the idea is not that you have to go to this extent in terms of thinking about all of the different connections, but really to start to make these connections. And one of the things that I think I would encourage all of you to think about is how you might work with people in other disciplines as well to try and help you to expand your view in terms of the root causes and the potential outcomes or unintended consequences of different nutrition problems and the interventions that they might address. Because when you're working with people from different disciplines, they tend to have different perspectives. And we all are trained in whatever discipline we are in a very specific way. There's more and more attention to systems thinking within education, but in general, at least my generation, we were not trained that way. And so if you're working with people from different disciplines, it can really help to sort of broaden your lens through which you see the nutrition problems and potential solutions. But also, they can identify gaps that you might not have even thought about. So what are the different approaches to analyzing systems? So I'm going to talk a little bit in a case study about looking at trans fat policy using a systems approach in India, which is something I did for my PhD work. And that is very qualitative. So in that sense, it was mapping the food systems from more of a qualitative perspective, doing interviews with key stakeholders, and literally just drawing these maps. I had these like massive maps, kind of mind maps of the different steps of the supply chain, and then looking at all the interconnections between them. But what I'm going to talk about right now, before I go into that, is just some of the different ways to analyze systems in a more quantitative way. And Evie's going to talk a little bit more about systems dynamics and group-based modeling in particular. And you'll also have an entire lecture on that, I believe. So systems dynamics are complex behaviors of systems, so say prevalence of malnutrition, which result from interplay of feedback loops, stocks, and flows and delays. So when you're doing, say, group-based modeling, which is generally when you're working with community members to understand the relationships that they see throughout their system, you kind of identify these feedback systems. And this can be really helpful in terms of understanding the problem from the perspective of the community, but also identifying solutions in terms of how to address some of the causes of the problem that might not be what first comes to mind when you're thinking about that nutrition problem. So kind of, like I said, broadens your perspective in terms of what might be leading to the outcome, and maybe some more innovative places where you might intervene within the food system. Network analysis focuses on the relationships among sets of actors. So there's very kind of famous or maybe now infamous studies related to obesity in the US and looking at people's relationships. And there's this study that was, had kind of, the slogan of it was that obesity was contagious, just because it kind of within social networks, there was higher prevalence of obesity within kind of groups of people that were familiar with one another. I think some of that work has been a bit debunked, but the last is agent-based modeling. And this is really when you simulate, you have the system and you're simulating individuals moving through that system. This is, I would say, a more labor-intensive way of modeling the system, and it definitely requires expertise in this area, but also, I think, a bit more time. And it's really just, you know, some of the limitations, just like any modeling, is based on the assumptions. And I think sometimes in agent-based modeling, unless it's really fed with good quality data, there can be a lot of assumptions that might not be realistic in terms of the context of people's real lived experiences. So why is it important to think about systems interventions in terms of development and implementation? So one of the key things is that there are unintended consequences. So as I mentioned previously, in terms of the conditional cash transfers in Mexico, you can sometimes have these unintended consequences where what you're trying to achieve might lead to something that you do not want to happen. So in that case, it was increasing in overweight and obesity among mothers that were included in this program, while undernutrition was addressed and there was a decrease in undernutrition. You had this unintended consequence that obviously wasn't the intent of the program. So what are some examples, and you can use the chat or you can unmute yourself, of the unintended consequences of specific public health interventions? So I gave you the example of the conditional cash transfers, but are there other examples that you can think of? And you can put them in the chat, unmute. I'm not seeing anything.
The question is that what are some examples of the unintended consequences of specific public health interventions?
And it's on the slide too, if you,
yes.
Yeah. And the consequence. But this is an example of when you don't know the context well enough and you design an intervention. So for example, there have been studies where they've been looking at, this is ages ago, so not the recent history, but where you have an intervention that is supplementation of a specific nutrient, say vitamin A, and the researchers aren't doing good assessments before designing the intervention and implement a intervention that is supplementation when there isn't already, it has an unintended consequence per se, but it doesn't have an impact because it isn't addressing the real problem. And that's just to say that, you know, one of the things that I think is really critical and something that I definitely incorporate in my own work is to understand the context really, really well before you actually decide to implement an intervention. Renuma?
Yes, when I raise hand, you already mentioned about the context. So context is very important. So before designing an intervention, it's better to have a co-design or participatory research method with the local community and also expert from that context. So they will understand what kind of intervention will go better in this area, in this community. So I can give one example from my research, like my ongoing research. So we have provided meat safe. This is something that will secure cooked food from pet or other insects in slum areas. So when we have provided them meat safe in our intervention group, so they have some misunderstanding, like those have refrigerator, they even not keeping their food in the refrigerator. They are thinking that it is the very good to keep it in the meat safe, even in warm days. So then after few follow-up visit, we realized, no, we are giving not clear message. So from that part, we also corrected the nudges and then make them understand it's not the same effect as refrigerator. So yeah.
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Okay.
I also see in the chat, people sell RUTF intended for SAM children. Yes, so that's like one of the, I mean, for example, there's a lot of countries that still have, say, subsidies for fortified oils, as an example. So in Guatemala, where there's very high levels of overweight and obesity, as well as very high levels of stunting, they still have, sugar that's fortified, or say oils. And sometimes that could have an unintended consequence of, people thinking, oh, this sugar is healthy, or the RUTF is really healthy. And it is for a specific purpose, right? But thinking about it as something that you're just consuming all the time isn't really the intention of it. And that's one of the issues too with some of the products that are intended to treat malnutrition or undernutrition. Is there's this idea then that people get the sense that like those cookies are really good for you, or cookies are healthy, when in reality that's, there's that's the unintended consequence, that the perceptions then shift in terms of the healthfulness. I also see antimicrobial resistance, great example. Blanket BP supplementation to pregnant women may increase obesity. Fortification of sugar and bouillon cubes. Yeah, exactly. So those are great examples. Thanks for sharing those. Programs providing free supplements may reduce focus on long-term food security solutions or dietary diversity. Yes, great. And that is an issue, right? In terms of, we always have this, view, or there's this tendency, I should say, to find some quick solution, something that's easy. Changing people's diets isn't easy, but providing supplementation, for example, or product, that might be more straightforward, but it doesn't necessarily always address the situation, and the nutrition problem. So thanks for sharing. Great. Oops. All right. So I'm going to just quickly, because I'm just checking the time, provide a quick case study that's related to trans fat reduction in India. So like I said, this is from my PhD work, which is old now, about 10 years old. But it was using more qualitative methods, like I said, to map out the system related to edible oils in India, and think about where the policy levers might be after mapping out the full system. So to identify policy levers that might not have been the first things that you think about. They might not have been intuitive initially. So this is just bringing you back to the HLP report. This is the actual original HLPE report, food systems figure. So I mentioned earlier when I was showing the other figure that there's less arrows in that version. So this is the one that has a lot more going on. So in terms of taking a food systems approach to reducing trans fat in India, I looked at the drivers, the food supply chain, food environment, et cetera. And I'll just kind of walk you through some of the things that we found. And this work was done with Dr. Supana Ghosh as well. She was really my main mentor for this work, and helped shepherd me throughout the process. So one of the things that we looked at was edible oil import and export policies, because that influences what oils people are using or manufacturers are using to create partially hydrogenated vegetable oils like vanaspati, as well as the ability to replace those oils with something that's healthier. So for example, to shift away from, if you're going to replace vanaspati with something in a bakery product, you need something that has a similar consistency so that it works, right, in the baking process. And so a lot of times that shift ends up being to palm oil, because palm oil at the time there was 0% duty, so there was no tax in terms of its import in India, which made it really cheap, and it was super widely available, right? It's produced in huge amounts and has become ubiquitous within the food supply and food system. Another aspect was looking at access to appropriate technology and infrastructure, because a lot of the companies didn't have access to the technology required to change their manufacturing processes for vanaspati to reduce the trans fat. And there's also social and cultural norms, which was one of the factors that came up in the chat related to food system driver, related to edible oil consumption. So in terms of the food supply chain, we thought about the production of replacement oils, as I mentioned, and not just the import, but also producing them within the country. Transparency of distribution channels, because there was the potential for adulteration, and there's a conception that there is adulteration within the food supply. I would say actually there's data that shows that there's also adulteration within the food supply chain of edible oils. Product reformulation capacity was important to consider because, like I said, not all these manufacturers had the technology. Some of them are really small manufacturers. So when you're thinking about policies too, and their ability to actually follow the policy, they might not have the capacity to do so. They need support in many cases. In terms of the food environment, affordability of replacement oils was really critical in thinking about how you might intervene. The presence and accuracy of labels. So a lot of edible oils at the time, and still in some places, didn't have labels. So there wasn't transparency in terms of what you're actually purchasing. So even if you as a consumer wanted to shift away from consuming an oil that was high in trans fat, it's not always possible to do that if you don't have the information to make that choice. And that's very much linked to knowledge related to replacement oils. So often there's a gap in terms of the knowledge related to edible oils in particular. And there's a lot of misinformation around edible oils. I mean, even I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and they were telling me these things about oils. They had watched some documentary on edible oils, and this person's in public health. And I was just very confused by the messaging they were receiving. So I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of trends related to edible oils, like say coconut as an example. So all of this influences people's fat intake and saturated fat and trans fat intake in particular. And I say saturated fat as well as trans because a lot of times, like I said, the replacement oils are palm oil. And then the fat intake and the makeup of your fat intake impacts obviously health outcomes. There can also be impacts in terms of equity because a lot of times the healthier oils are more expensive. And then you might have also the impact of replacement oils on the environment. So maybe you're shifting to edible oils that have a higher impact on the environment. So palm oil as an example, while it's always kind of touted as really bad for the environment, it's much more nuanced. So it is, it does lead to a lot of biodiversity loss. But it's super productive. So you don't need as much land to produce as much oil as some of the other oils. So there's trade-offs. And I think that's one of the things that maybe through thinking about the food system more broadly, hopefully will become more clear, is that it's often not kind of black or white. There's a lot of nuance in terms of thinking about where the most effective lever is within the food system to implement a policy. So something to consider. I think that life just in general is about trade-offs, I think, but when we're thinking about interventions within the food system, I think it also is. So this is just kind of breaking it down much further. So this is taking these maps I had that were, like I said, they were kind of these huge maps, and then trying to make them a little bit more comprehensible. And then look at the connections. And like I said, this was all qualitative. It wasn't using systems dynamics or any of the approaches that I mentioned earlier. So we started by thinking about what are all the factors at the production or inputs into production level that are impacting the ability to reduce trans fat in the food supply and replace it with healthier oils. So things like soil degradation, low yields, overuse of fertilizer, and all this information came from doing document analysis. So looking at policy documents, existing data, sometimes using Euromonitor data, and also doing a lot of interviews with key stakeholders in different sectors. So not just, nutrition people, but also people from agriculture, from food processing, manufacturers of vanaspati, etc. So basically, the idea from that is that there are low yields of edible oils that were produced within India. Then as we looked down the supply chain, there are things like lack of storage, fragmented supply chains, a lot of wastage. There's palm oil development programs. So there was an initiative to increase palm oil development within the country. And all of those pieces showed that there was this fragmented supply chain. So you're starting with low yields of healthy oils, then the supply chain is really fragmented. So there's less availability, and that impacts affordability. And then you have this reliance on imports because of that. So because you don't have enough produced within the country, for all of these different reasons, you have to rely on imports. And in the case of India, but also many countries around the world, that leads to importing palm oil just because, like I said, it's very cheap, it's ubiquitous, there's generally no duties on it. And then that leads to low quality fat being widely available, affordable, and acceptable within the food supply. So the next step for this work was really then to think about how you might intervene to try and address those challenges across the system. So for example, in terms of input supply, it might be research and development for improved seed varieties. So those that are high yielding, maybe that in the context of a changing climate, maybe it's seed varieties that do better in drought conditions or maybe in flood conditions, depending on what the local context is. You could have subsidies for higher quality seeds for healthier oils, access to credit for oilseed farmers, just as some examples. I won't go through all of these, but just to give you a sense of like how you take that information of all these connections and then think about where the levers are throughout the supply chain. In terms of production and post-harvest, it might be things like improving extension, intercropping, the promotion of cooperatives, for processing, subsidies for investment in technology required for product reformulation, or tax incentives for companies using healthier oils in product formulation. So the idea is to try and make it easier for these smaller companies that maybe don't have as much capacity and also might not have as much capital to be able to reformulate in a way that is healthier. Then from a marketing and retail perspective, it might be, say, government training to street vendors regarding use of healthier oils, could be a behavior change communication campaign related to trans fat, because there was low awareness related to trans fat at the time. And the government actually did have a advertising campaign related to trans fat eventually. And then at the consumption and food utilization stage, it might be training and preparation of foods using healthier oils, or not saving oils and repeatedly using them over time, those types of things. So those are just to give you some examples. When you're thinking about the systems, it often becomes very clear that you need to target multiple points in the food system. So you're not going to have just like one intervention. Like, for example, in the chat, there was the comment about like just providing, say, a supplement of some sort, and then everything is solved. That's not how it works. And when you start to look at all of the interactions within the system, you start to identify many different leverage points. And I think that's one of the things that's really important for us to think about when we're thinking about interventions, is we probably need to intervene on multiple levels, and kind of doing this very straightforward type of intervention is likely not going to yield the impacts that we want to see. So now I'm going to pass it over to Evie.
Great, thank you, Shona. Great, that was really interesting. The case study I'm presenting is about the double burden of malnutrition in Peru. It's a bit of a different context. Yeah, next slide, please. The main objective of this work was to identify what are the dynamics, the drivers, the food system drivers that contribute to this double burden of malnutrition in Peru, hopefully to help us inform some opportunities for actions against it. And we used so-called community-based system dynamics. So system dynamics, as Shona mentioned earlier, is a mixed method, a qualitative and quantitative components to it, to explore complex systems by acknowledging and identifying and quantifying some of these characteristics of complex systems that I mentioned in the beginning. And I'm going to describe a bit more about this as we go forward. And previous slide, please.
Oh.
The community-based part of it it shows that throughout this process, we have engagement with different stakeholders that help us inform both the qualitative and the quantitative components of this work. All right, so that's the overall objective. The first step towards kind of a complex system approach is to identify the problem, understand the problem. And because we're interested in the dynamic behavior, this is what systems thinking can help us understand, we tend to use these kind of behavior over time graphs to describe the problem. So for example, here we looked at how overweight in women of reproductive age has changed over years in Peru. We see that there is a rapid increase, more rapid than on average in Latin America. And we also looked at stunting in children under the age of 5, and we understand that stunting has been reducing a lot over the last 20 years. And although the problem is mostly accumulated in rural areas, there is something that drives this reduction in stunting. So the first step is to describe the problem by looking at how it changed over time. And then the second step, next slide, please, is to understand what are the drivers of this problem. What makes, let's say in that case, overweight going up, and what makes stunting going down. And for this, we create what we call a dynamic hypothesis, which is essentially a graph that shows all these drivers of the problem that we want to explore. And for this, we engage with several stakeholders in Peru. This is a published paper in case you want to look in more detail on the explicit ways that we engage with these stakeholders. Also, in one of the coming up sessions, you're going to experience some of these as participants. We're going to do an example of some of these approaches. But I'm going to give you just a short overview of what we've done. So next slide, please. We conducted 5 workshops in 2 different regions in Peru that have different socio-demographic and kind of malnutrition characteristics. And we engaged with different types of stakeholders, from parents to kind of researchers and health service providers like doctors and nutritionists, to people from NGOs and also policymakers. Next slide, please. And we did several different workshops, either with individual groups or with bringing people all together. And I don't think I can use a pointer? Anyways, that's fine. I'll show you. So, oh, there it is. So the first part, the first component of these workshops were essentially asking people to identify what they think are these drivers of the double burden of malnutrition, but also think how these have changed over time to capture this dynamic behavior of the system. And after we did that, we asked people to think how these different characteristics interact with each other in order to create this map of how the drivers, what is the system structure essentially. And after this, the team, we use these graphs within the research team to synthesize into one map, which was then fed back into the participants who gave further input and so on. Next slide, please. And this is what we came up with. I'm not going to go into details with everything that you see here, but there are a few things I want to highlight. First of all, this type of diagram, it's called a causal loop diagram. It's very common. You might see it in publications on systems thinking as a qualitative tool to describe kind of this system structure of a complex system. If you see here, there are a few of these characteristics that I described in the beginning of the lecture that are captured here. The first thing is that there is a bunch of different feedback mechanisms that we have shown, they are noted with these kind of little arrows here, and shows how there are so many different feedback mechanisms within this complex system. The second part are all these delays. We use these parallel lines to denote delays in this causal loop diagram kind of notation. So a lot of different delays were also identified. And then finally, these boxes here are what we use to to show accumulations. And in this case, it's accumulations of consumption habit. So why we know that this is a complex system is because it has all these different characteristics that are essentially that characterize a complex system. Right. Next slide, please. So from kind of having this qualitative hypothesis of what we think are the system structure that drives the double burden of malnutrition in Peru, according to stakeholder views, we then move on to formulating a quantitative model. Essentially, we take something like this and we make it into, next slide, please, into something like this, essentially taking this kind of qualitative variables and quantifying them either using data or using equations that show how these different variables interact. So after going through this process, then we have a quantitative model that quantifies at least some of this this understanding of stakeholders about what drives the double burden of malnutrition. So then we can use this model to test different interventions, different things that we can change in order to improve the double burden of malnutrition in the country. And for this, we were guided by, previous slide, please. For this, we were guided, yeah, this one, by this framework. This is called the 12 Types of Leverage Points framework by Donella Meadows. This is a very well-known framework in systems thinking and has been adapted in many ways, including for public health. But this is more like the original one that essentially argues that there are different ways that we can intervene within a complex system on increasing levels of effectiveness, right? And we can start with the least effective ones, for example, here, the ones that are less likely to really tilt the scale and make a change. Things like changing constants or parameters within the system. So what does that mean? For example, we change the price of food through taxation or subsidy. These are the policies that we most likely, think first when we think about nutrition interventions. But within a complex system, it's likely that there will be forces within the system that resist this change. So let's say we implement a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, but the industry might take different actions in order to counterbalance this potential decrease in their sales, right? So they might, have price discounts, offers, or like change their packaging, change the size of their packages, and so on, in order to avoid this from happening, right? So they might make a change, but usually it's a small change because the system will resist this. Then some more potentially effective interventions are those that, target these basic characteristics of a complex system, things like delays, feedback mechanisms, and accumulations. Changing these, because these are what really drives a behavior of a problem, might be more likely to make a change. But really, the most effective ways are maybe a bit more theoretical in this case, but are really the ways that the system is regulated, the goals of the system. So, for example, if the goal of the global food system is to create profit for transnational food corporations, then it's a great system. It does its job. It works very well. When we are trying to change the system, for example, to achieve better health, better nutrition, the system will resist. Things will happen in order for the sales to keep coming up. Because this is the goal of the system. It works well for what its purpose is. Changing this and making, a food system that its main purpose is to provide health or healthy nutrition could be a way to make our interventions and policies actually work in the long term. So this might be a bit all theoretical, but it is a well-known framework within systems thinking. You might see it again. But how do we interpret that within our project? Next slide, please. So next slide. So the first kind of scenario model is at the parameter level, maybe the least effective. And we said, okay, what would happen if we increase the price of ultra-processed foods, let's say through a tax or something like that? Next one, the second scenario will intervene to different delays. For example, stakeholders told us that there is a long time between a problem being identified. For example, we know that overweight is a problem in Peru, and from this time until an action is actually implemented, it will take a long time for these decision-making processes to take place. Next one, what if we change different feedback mechanisms? For example, a feedback mechanism described by stakeholders is that there is actually a mechanism through which the effectiveness of a policy is fed back into stakeholders, so they know if the program works and they further support it, or maybe they want to stop it if it does or doesn't work. What if we strengthen this feedback mechanism so that stakeholders get better information about how policies work and if they work well or not? Next one are different scenarios around different rules of the system. For example, there are policies in Peru against undernutrition, essentially food aid policies. And the goal of these policies is to reduce undernutrition. So they don't really take into account the quality of food provided, because the main goal is to improve undernutrition. If we change the rules and we also consider its impact on overnutrition and improve the quality of this food, we might see some impact on double burden of malnutrition. But the final one, and maybe the hardest to achieve, is really changing the goals of the system. Because currently the food system in Peru, or the policies that are implemented, either target undernutrition or they target overnutrition. And this effort, political will, and resources that go toward policy sometimes are splitting up or are competitive between either the one or the other. So what would happen if we change the goal of policymakers and essentially we target the double burden of malnutrition as a common entity? It might break away from this competitive structure between either or into common actions targeting a common problem. And yes, after next slide, please. So modeling all these different scenarios, we actually saw that there are a lot of ways that the system can resist change, and really just changing the goals of the system is really the most important and the most effective way to actually make a difference for overweight. And sometimes for stunting, stunting is on your right side, overweight is on your left side. So with stunting, sometimes we saw that actually efforts to improve overweight can actually unintendedly harm efforts to improve stunting, whereas targeting both overnutrition and undernutrition as a common goal is likely to impact both at the same time.